shipyards don't die with an explosion. They die quietly, one contract at a time. There was a moment in 1943 when the United States was finishing roughly 3 Liberty ships a day. Welders lit up the night like a man-made aurora. Union crews clocked in by the thousands. And a cargo vessel could go from keel, laid to launch in under 6 weeks if everything clicked. 4.5 days in one famous publicity sprint. If you want to understand how industrial empires fade, start there. With a country that could pour steel into the ocean faster than anyone could sink it. And then, within a lifetime, found itself building almost none of the world's commercial ships at all. The World War II boom wasn't an accident of patriotism so much as an experiment in mass production. The US standardized designs, broke hulls into prefabricated sections, and turned shipbuilding into something that looked suspiciously like an assembly line. 18 yards stamped out 2,710 Liberty ships, and when the Navy wanted faster, longer-legged vessels, the system coughed up more than 500 Victory ships too. Henry Kaiser's yards recruited women and black workers at scale, built on-site daycares, and treated the whole waterfront like a rolling, welded New Deal. It was chaotic and improvised and breathtakingly effective, the kind of national mobilization that rearranges a city's skyline and your assumptions about what's possible. Then, the war ended, and physics reasserted itself. Wars leave behind equipment, and equipment doesn't just vanish. The US had a mountain of ships and not enough peacetime cargo to justify building more. Washington mothballed thousands into the National Defense Reserve fleet, while selling others off at prices commercial owners could actually pay. If you were a ship owner in 1946, why order a sparkling new build at a yard with higher wages when the government would sell you a perfectly serviceable freighter out of its surplus lot? This glut didn't just hit America, it warped the global market for years. It's hard to run a competitive new ship industry when the world is swimming in good enough old ships that cost a fraction of the price. Here's the twist most people miss. The United States also tried to protect its shipyards and merchant fleet with laws that accidentally throttled demand. The Jones Act, passed in 1920 and still the law of the land, says that if you want to move cargo between 2 U.S. ports, your ship has to be U.S. built, U.S. flagged, mostly U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed. On paper, that's a recipe for national resilience. In practice, it created a walled garden with very expensive plants. US-built ships cost multiples of their foreign peers, in part because we weren't selling many, which meant we never got the economies of scale and relentless iteration that drive costs down. Buyers inside the Jones Act market learned to cope by simply buying fewer ships and sweating the assets they had. Outside that bubble, U.S. yards struggled to compete at international prices without help. For a while, they got the help. Mid-century America experimented with construction subsidies to bridge the price gap and keep yards busy. In the 1970s, you could still count more than a dozen major private yards, and some good years saw 15 to 25 commercial ships slide down American ways. Then, in 1981, the federal government pulled the plug on the Construction Differential Subsidy Program. The logic was simple. Stop paying to win a price war you weren't set up to win. And the effect was devastatingly simple too. Orders disappeared, yards consolidated, then closed. The ones that survived increasingly did so by building for a single, very patient customer, the Pentagon. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a different story was taking shape, one that looks less like miracle and more like a disciplined, state-backed relay race. Japan picked up the baton first. During the 1950s and 60s, Japanese shipbuilders rebuilt with a kind of ruthless practicality, supported by long-term, low-interest capital from development banks and export credit agencies that made their ships easy for foreign buyers to finance. They reorganized yards around flow, plate shops feeding panel lines, blocks moving under gantry cranes, welding techniques standardized and spread. By the early 1970s, Japan was the world's shipbuilding superpower, supplying giant tankers to feed the oil age and cranking out so much tonnage that European and American yards were left chasing their wake. South Korea didn't just copy that model, it scaled it. In the 1970s, under an all-in heavy industry push, Seoul cleared land for massive coastal complexes, directed cheap credit to chosen firms, and invited foreign technology, and sometimes foreign financing, to jumpstart capacity. Hyundai Heavy Industries literally sold its vision with a picture of a shipyard before one existed, then built the yard and its first supertankers almost simultaneously. If Japan honed the production system, Korea industrialized the real estate around it. Mega docks, Goliath cranes, kilometer-long panel lines, and a workforce trained to move steel blocks through stations with automotive cadence. By the 1990s and 2000s, Korean yards were bidding and winning orders for high-spec LNG carriers and mega container ships, the kinds of contracts that require mind-numbing precision and a bank that believes in you. Then came China, and the curve bent again. In the 2000s and 2010s, Beijing rolled out a comprehensive playbook: merge giant state-owned conglomerates, feed them with policy bank loans and local subsidies, tie shipbuilding to broader goals like export growth and a bigger navy, and capture the bulk of global orders by being big, fast, and, on financing, very accommodating. The result is the world we live in now, where China builds more commercial tonnage than anyone, Korea follows with high-end niches, and Japan remains a major player with deep expertise and full order books. Between the three, they deliver roughly 95% of the planet's new commercial ships. That's not a market with some regional clusters. That's a three-country oligopoly. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps a ton and tells the algorithm this kind of deep dive is worth pushing to more people. So why didn't the United States just keep competing? Partly because we chose a different customer. Military programs are long, political, and budget-driven, but they don't require you to be the cheapest place on Earth to build a tanker. Once the Navy became the anchor client, private yards rationally optimized for Navy work. Thicker plate, different tolerances, unique specs, elaborate contracting, everything that makes a destroyer or submarine one-off special. That ecosystem doesn't translate cleanly to rows of mass-market container ships rolled off at tight margins. You can be excellent at both, but it's hard to be excellent at both at the same time if you aren't doing both at scale. Another reason is price, which is a short word for a long chain of decisions. American yards face higher labor costs and buy many inputs in smaller runs. They rarely build 10 of the exact same ship back to back, which means fewer lessons learned, fewer jigs and fixtures amortized across hundreds of hulls, fewer vendors willing to set up shop next door. Financing is also tougher. In Japan, Korea, and China, governments and policy banks have long eased the path for foreign buyers. Borrow cheap, pay over time, and everyone goes home happy with a new ship and a filled dry dock. Try getting that deal for a US-built ship in the global market, and you'll feel the headwinds instantly. The American regulatory framework didn't help because it tried to do too many jobs at once. The Jones Act is a national security tool, an industrial policy legacy, and a jobs program braided into one law. But its domestic build rule shrinks the buyer pool to a small, protected market that can't sustain the learning cycles you need to compete internationally. A smaller run of expensive ships drives the cost even higher, which shrinks the market further. It's a loop, and not the virtuous kind. The result is an odd split screen, impressive military yards that can build world-class combatants, and a commercial sector that most years delivers only a handful of large ocean-going ships, often for the same small set of US customers. The economic center of gravity for commercial shipbuilding moved to places that treated it like a national export business, not a patriotic favor. In post-war Japan, that meant a close alliance between ministries, finance, and industry, the convoy system, where credit, technology, and orders moved as a coordinated whole. In South Korea, it meant carving a ship on the map first, and trusting that the orders would come if the yard was large and credible enough. In China, it meant tying shipbuilding to an entire maritime strategy, ports, logistics platforms, naval expansion, and a financial state that could push capital at the speed of policy. The through line is not mysterious. Steady demand, long-term capital, and the will to build complexes big enough to be their own weather systems. Could the US come back? There are two answers. The first is the politician's answer. Yes, if we decide to. The second is the engineer's answer. Yes, but decide to what exactly? If the goal is to be a significant exporter of commercial ships, again, you need three things that are hard to fake. You need scale, yards that can push hulls through in a flow, not in artisanal bursts. You need patient financing that meets buyers where they are, meaning export credits, guarantees, and insurance that can stare down a 25-year amortization. And you need orders, enough sameness that the fifth ship is cheaper and faster than the first, and the 50th is a masterclass. That's not impossible, but it's not a 5-year ribbon cutting either. It's an industrial decade. What we're seeing right now is a messy attempt to tilt the playing field back. Washington has flirted with fees on Chinese-built vessels, calling it U.S. ports, explored new funds to reseed commercial yards, and tried to enlist allies like Japan and South Korea to invest in American facilities or bring their processes stateside. Some of this will help around the margins, especially if it spreads know-how and tackles bottlenecks in the supplier base. But there's a broader question under all of it. Are we trying to rebuild a domestic commercial shipbuilding sector to sell to the world? Or are we trying to protect a domestic shipping market from the world? Those aren't the same strategy, and blurring them is how you end up disappointed. The irony is that America didn't so much lose the shipbuilding race as decide to run a different event. We kept the high ground in naval construction and let the commodity market for commercial hulls go to places that were obsessed with it. Japan won with financing and discipline. Korea won with scale and process. China is winning with state capacity and volume. And the oceans, indifferent as always, made room for whoever could deliver hulls on time and on terms that made sense to ship owners, balancing spreadsheets against the price of a day at sea. So, the death of the American shipyard is really a story about how industrial ecosystems drift when demand, policy, and capital point in new directions. It's about how post-war surplus distorted a market just long enough for a new set of builders to step in with better financing and bigger yards. It's about how a well-intentioned law can accidentally starve the very industry it means to protect. Most of all, it's a reminder that heavy industry is not a birthright. It's a habit you have to practice, at scale, with customers who are just as demanding as judges at a piano recital. Stop practicing, and someone else will take the stage. You'll find every source I used linked below. If this story resonated, our last video explains why wind power is now cheap to generate but hasn't made your bill cheap. Yet.